Have you ever felt forgotten or left out? Have you ever had a time when it seemed like nothing in your life made sense or that everything was lost? Many of us have found ourselves in situations like this, where hope seems distant and our hearts feel heavy. Perhaps you have experienced moments of loss, limitations, or a sense of inadequacy that have made you question your worth and place in the world. The story of Mephibosheth, recorded in the Old Testament, is exactly that. A journey of someone who had everything to live for, forgotten, limited, and without hope, but who found an unexpected gesture of kindness and redemption. Mephibosheth's life teaches us how grace can appear in moments when we least expect it, completely changing the course of our lives. What is interesting is that Mephibosheth's story goes beyond the physical limitations and emotional challenges he faced. It reveals an amazing act of love and compassion, showing us that even when we feel weak and worthless, there is a God who sees us, values us, and calls us to something greater. Let us reflect on this story and discover together how God can transform our lives with a gesture of grace, even in the most difficult times. Who knows, by learning about Mephibosheth's life, we can see our own story with new eyes and realize that, just like him, we also have a place of honor prepared for us. But first, if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe for new incredible videos from the Old Testament. Your subscription and like are very important for us to spread this message. Mephibosheth is a moving and impactful figure in the Old Testament. He was the grandson of Saul, the first king of Israel, and the son of Jonathan, a close friend of David, the young man who would later become king and would be known as the man after God's own heart. In the lineage of a royal family, Mephibosheth was born into an environment of power and influence, with the promise of a privileged life. However, a tragic event changed the course of his story. Mephibosheth was only 5 years old when life brought him a turnaround. His grandfather Saul and father Jonathan were killed in a battle against the Philistines, as recorded in 1 Samuel 31. This event, in addition to being a personal and emotional loss for Mephibosheth, had political implications. It meant the fall of the house of Saul and the end of his dynasty over Israel. In the culture of the time, it was common for new kings to eliminate the descendants of the previous king to prevent possible claims to the throne. Therefore, upon hearing of the death of Saul and Jonathan, Mephibosheth's nurse feared for the boy's safety and fled with him. However, amid the panic and rush, tragedy struck. The nurse dropped Mephibosheth. This accident resulted in a permanent injury to his feet, leaving him crippled, 2 Samuel 4 verse 4. This moment left a profound mark on Mephibosheth's life, defining his trajectory and his future. A prince, heir to a royal line, he came to depend on others to take care of his needs. In a culture where physical limitations were often seen as a weakness or shame, this disability further removed him from a position of honor and influence. After the fall of Saul's family and David's ascension to the throne, Mephibosheth grew up in an environment where his royal heritage and identity were constantly under threat. He was taken to Lodabar, an isolated and deserted place considered a land without resources or prestige. There, he lived as a fugitive and probably in constant fear that the new king, David, would come looking for him and eliminate him. He spent years believing that he was worthless, constantly reminded of his physical condition and the tragic end of his family. Mephibosheth's situation makes us reflect on how we can often feel that our past, limitations, or losses define our worth. He was a man marked by trauma. The loss of his family, his fall and disability, and his move to a place of isolation. He could easily have convinced himself that his life was destined to be meaningless. In Lodabar, Mephibosheth likely lived with the stigma and shame of being forgotten and broken. After all, he was the remnant of a rejected lineage, and to many, he was nothing more than a reminder of the past. He did not choose to be the grandson of Saul or the son of Jonathan. He did not choose for his father and grandfather to die in war, and he did not choose the disability he carried throughout his life. Yet all of these things shaped who he was and how he viewed himself. His story can be seen as a representation of the human condition. Hardship, limitation, and loss can often make us feel doomed to isolation and oblivion. In his isolation and seeming insignificance, he was still part of God's purpose. His life reminds us that even when situations seem irreversible, God can intervene and transform our reality. Mephibosheth represents all those who, due to external circumstances, have lost what was precious and found themselves in a position of vulnerability. He reminds us that our identity and our worth are not defined by the limitations we carry, but by the love and purpose that God has for us. Jonathan, Mephibosheth's father, had made a deep covenant of friendship and loyalty with David before his death. This pact was more than a formal agreement. It was a sincere commitment between two friends who respected each other and shared a deep trust. Jonathan, as the son of King Saul, knew that David would be God's next chosen king, and he accepted this reality with humility. Rather than rivalry, Jonathan had a genuine love and respect for David, and the two sealed their bond with a promise. David would protect Jonathan's descendants no matter what the circumstances. 1 Samuel 20 verses 14 to 15. After Jonathan and Saul died in battle against the Philistines, David faced years of struggle until he consolidated his reign over all Israel. He could easily have forgotten this promise, especially in a time when it was common to eliminate any descendants of the previous dynasty to protect the new line. However, David's character and his love for Jonathan spoke louder. When he became king, he still kept in his heart the covenant he had made with his friend and wanted to honor that promise. Having established himself as king of Israel, David could easily have forgotten the past or adopted the common practice of the time, eliminating the descendants of the previous dynasty to ensure the stability of the throne. However, he did something surprising. Instead of seeking revenge or acting indifferently, David decided to seek out someone from the house of Saul, especially from Jonathan's descendants, to show kindness. This shows how faithful he was to the memory of his friend and the covenant they had made. The Bible records that David asked, "Is there still any of the house of Saul left that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" 2 Samuel 9 verse 1. This question was not merely political. It was an act of genuine compassion, motivated by the desire to honor the commitment of friendship that he and Jonathan had made. The expression "to show kindness" comes from the Hebrew hesed, which represents a loyal and committed love, a kindness that goes beyond personal interests and that remains, even when there is no return. David's search for Mephibosheth reveals much about the king's character. He was a man who took his promises seriously, who recognized the value of covenants, and, above all, who had a tender heart. David did not simply rule with force. He also ruled with compassion and integrity. His decision to seek out a descendant of Jonathan, rather than acting with indifference or contempt, teaches us that true power lies in showing mercy, even when one has the authority to do otherwise. By finding Ziba, a former servant in the house of Saul, David finally learned that Jonathan's son Mephibosheth was alive but living in poverty and isolation. This step by David, seeking out Mephibosheth, the son of his dear friend, shows that he recognized the importance of personal connections and that the past, when marked by bonds of love and fidelity, deserves to be remembered and honored. David's promise to Jonathan is an example of faithfulness and integrity, reminding us that sincere friendships are precious and should be honored, even after the one we love has left. Rather than seeking revenge or acting selfishly, we should choose the path of compassion, honoring our promises and valuing the bonds that God allows us to build. When Mephibosheth was summoned to David's presence, he was probably overcome with fear. After all, he was the grandson of Saul, the first king of Israel, and time had seen stories of new kings eliminating the descendants of the previous dynasty to protect the throne. For him, David's summons may have heralded his end. He had spent years living in Lodabar, an isolated and remote place, without the privileges that royal lineage might have afforded him. Crippled and without prospects, he depended on the charity of others to survive. As he approached David, Mephibosheth prostrated himself in reverence and fear, a posture that reflected both his respect and his insecurity. He saw a powerful king before him, and at the same time, he did not know what to expect from that encounter. But what he heard from David was something completely unexpected. With words of kindness, David said, "Do not be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of Jonathan your father." 2 Samuel 9 verse 7. These words transformed the atmosphere, dispelling any shadow of fear that Mephibosheth had carried. David's gesture represents one of the most touching moments in biblical history. Mephibosheth's fear, which was understandable, gave way to a feeling of peace and relief, for he was not before a vengeful king, but a friend faithful to his father. David saw Mephibosheth not as a potential enemy, but as the son of Jonathan, his dear friend. He saw the covenant he had made and was willing to honor it, despite the conventions of the time. This reaction by David and the impact on Mephibosheth reveal the transformative power of kindness and grace. Mephibosheth found himself, in that moment, freed from fear and surrounded by the kindness of someone who recognized the value of promises and bonds of friendship. This experience marks Mephibosheth's story in an unforgettable way, reminding us that true greatness lies in treating others with compassion and mercy, even when the world expects otherwise. David, faithful to his promise to Jonathan, not only spared Mephibosheth's life, but also restored to him all that had been lost over the years. He restored the lands that had belonged to his grandfather Saul, thus ensuring a source of sustenance and dignity for his life. This act of surprising generosity went far beyond what was expected, considering the context of the time, in which descendants of previous dynasties were usually eliminated to avoid threats to the throne. But David did more than restore Mephibosheth's patrimony. He invited him to eat at his own table, as if he were one of his own sons. 2 Samuel 9 verse 7. This act represents a profound transformation in Mephibosheth's identity. He, who had previously lived isolated and without hope in Lodabar, now found himself in a position of honor, treated as a member of the royal family. With this decision, David did more than fulfill a promise. He offered Mephibosheth a new beginning and a new dignity. Imagine the emotional impact of this moment for Mephibosheth. He had spent his life carrying the stigma of his disability, dependent on others, and with no prospects for change. Now he not only had material security, but he also belonged to a circle of honor. By eating at David's table, he was included in the royal family, the ultimate symbol of acceptance and care. This restoration also represents a spiritual transformation. Mephibosheth did not deserve to occupy this place of honor on his own. He was welcomed because of the love and covenant between David and Jonathan. Thus, he received undeserved grace, a kindness that surpassed human standards. David saw Mephibosheth with eyes of mercy and faithfulness, reaffirming the depth of the friendship he had shared with Jonathan. The story of Mephibosheth reminds us that God is also able to restore us, even when we feel lost and helpless. He offers us a place at his table, an invitation to be part of his family, not because we deserve it, but because of love. This illustrates the power of a grace that transforms, that redeems, and that calls us to a greater purpose. During Absalom's rebellion, his own son David was forced to flee Jerusalem. In the midst of this crisis, Mephibosheth's servant Ziba took advantage of the situation to unjustly accuse his master of treason, claiming that Mephibosheth had remained behind in Jerusalem in the hope that his grandfather Saul's throne would be restored to him. This accusation was a painful blow to David, who, without time to investigate the truth of Ziba's words, granted the servant all of Mephibosheth's inheritance. For David to hear that Mephibosheth himself might be betraying his trust and taking advantage of his escape was disheartening, to say the least, since he had shown him so much grace and kindness previously. However, the truth came out when David returned to the throne after the defeat of Absalom. Mephibosheth came to meet the king, and his physical condition spoke volumes about his faithfulness. He had not tended his feet or trimmed his beard, and his clothes were unkempt. 2 Samuel 19 verse 24. These signs showed that he was not in a state of celebration or comfort while David was in exile. On the contrary, he was mourning and grieving, showing genuine loyalty. Before the king, Mephibosheth explained his situation and made it clear that his servant had deceived him. David, probably touched by Mephibosheth's sincerity, offered a solution of dividing the land between himself and Ziba. But Mephibosheth's response was surprising. He said that Ziba could keep everything, because his only joy was to see David back on the throne. 2 Samuel 19 verse 30. For him, riches and material goods were of no importance compared to the privilege of serving and honoring the one who had welcomed and restored him. Mephibosheth's attitude reflects a humble and grateful heart. He was not attached to riches. His greatest treasure was his relationship of respect and loyalty with David. His response to the king shows that his gratitude was genuine and that he recognized the value of the kindness he had received. Mephibosheth, despite having suffered betrayal and slander, chose to trust in God and remain faithful to the one who had restored him. This loyalty reminds us that true loyalty goes beyond personal or material interests. It is born of a grateful and humble heart, which knows how to recognize the value of a grace received. Mephibosheth's faithfulness to David is a powerful lesson in humility and gratitude, showing that our greatest honor is to serve with integrity those who extend kindness to us. Just as David extended mercy and favor to Mephibosheth, God also extends undeserved grace to us, even when we have nothing to offer in return. Mephibosheth could do nothing to earn the king's favor, but David loved and honored him out of love for Jonathan. In the same way, God loves us and invites us to his table, not because of any merit of our own, but because of his goodness and love. The Bible does not provide specific details about the end of Mephibosheth's life, but what we do know is that he continued to live in Jerusalem, under David's care and eating at his table as part of the royal family. Even with his limitations and without a bright future in sight, he was rescued from a life of neglect and honored by David.